Hello, and welcome to Reinforcement Basics for Paraprofessionals. My name is Tara Moran. I am excited to be back here at the Para Educator Conference. It's one of my favorite professional development deliveries that we do. I work at IU 12, which services Adams, Franklin, and York counties. This session is going to be truly just the basics of how we can use reinforcement in the classroom. And I always try to keep in the front of my mind your role as a paraprofessional in the school setting. I love working with paraprofessionals. It is one of my favorite team members to work with in general. So I just love getting a chance to connect and just share with how valuable your role truly is to the students and to the school as a whole. So, our learning outcome for today is to plan for two specific ways that you can use reinforcement to impact the behavior of the students you support. I love this quote from Dr. Lori Desautels. It says, "A child's behavior isn't about me. They're not doing this to me. It's a symptom, like a sneeze showing us a cold, a cut with a wound, or a scab showing us healing. This behavior is showing us that the nervous system is rough. Can we become curious? What is underneath that behavior?" Often, when she says this, she has an image accompany what she is speaking on. And the image is either the surface of the ocean or an aerial view down on a really dense forest. And the point is that, like, we can only see such a small bit of what's actually going on underneath the surface. And behavior really is the same way. So right now, just to kind of level set, I know some of you are in here and you have been a paraprofessional and worked with kiddos for a very long time, and some of you are just stepping into a new role, or maybe you've lots of experience working with students, but now you're shifting to a different classroom or age group. Here are the things we're just going to level set on. We are going to assume that there are no bad kids. There are students who have received poor teaching, poor modeling, poor environments, poor situations, kids who have been just dealt a really tough hand of cards, but there are no bad kids. There are kids who make bad choices, but there are no bad kids. We cannot make students do what we want, but behavioral science, known as applied behavioral analysis, teaches us that we can shape student behavior in a safe, supportive manner so that they are able to participate meaningfully in the world around them. I always talk about students being able to engage with a community. And so the classroom might be your community, the school might be your community. And our goal is to make that as impactful of an experience as possible for them. And your students can and will learn from the world around them, right? We're always looking and noticing things, even if the kid doesn't seem like they're paying attention to the things around them, they are. And one of the best things you can do when we think about student behavior is to make yourself the most interesting and valuable thing they can learn from. That idea that the relationship and the rapport that you have with students is going to be the best tool in our toolkit. So when we're defining reinforcement, a reinforcer is anything that increases the likelihood of a behavior occurring again in the future. So a reinforcer could be something tangible, it could be something edible, it could just be a nonverbal reinforcer, it could be an action. There are so many different ways that we can reinforce the people around us. We reinforce behavior, not the student. This is really important because it kind of takes away that the emotional side of reinforcing or somebody not getting a reinforcer because it's them. It's not them, it's the behavior that we are reinforcing. We use reinforcement strategies throughout the student's day to increase, establish, or strengthen desirable behaviors. Our goal is to grow what they're able to do and make it easier for them to achieve those tasks. And reinforcement is a way to do that through some extrinsic motivation. We all need it at times, and your students really need it when they're trying to grow a new skill. Our long-term goal, just keep this in mind, is to move away from conditioned and supplemental reinforcement to more naturally occurring reinforcement. So, in the beginning, we might need to do a lot of reinforcement that is very planned. It may feel a little bit like false in terms of how realistic it is, but it's really important to remember that that is a temporary state. Our goal is always to fade the supports. Reinforcement can be positive or negative. Positive reinforcement is when we present an item, an object, an activity, like I said, following a behavior that increases the likelihood of that behavior occurring again. We're giving something, trying to get the behavior again. Negative reinforcement is when we terminate or take away something following a behavior. And again, we're increasing the likelihood that that behavior occurs again. So I feel like most people are pretty familiar with positive reinforcement. We tend to use this a lot more in our daily lives. But think about it as well that we can also take things away, and that might increase the likelihood of a behavior happening. So, when does reinforcement work best? To teach a new behavior. And of course, we want this to happen immediately after the behavior. And when we're teaching a new behavior, sometimes we will reinforce every single time a behavior happens. Again, this is because the behavior is new. It's harder for the student. They don't necessarily have that habit or that muscle memory or that instinct to do it intrinsically without any sort of external reinforcer. And we also reinforce to maintain behavior. Again, this should still be immediately, but we might not give it every single time because we're starting to try to fade our role in them performing the behavior. So, reinforcement and shaping behavior, positive reinforcement works best when it is used purposefully to shape student behavior. This could be, they should be high value. That's a really purposeful thing to consider. When you're working with one student in your autism support classroom, that does not necessarily mean that the student next to them values the same reinforcer. Even if you have a student who's not in a special ed setting, there are kiddos in general education who value attention, and there are students who attention is the worst thing they could ever imagine. So making sure it's something that the student values so that it's meaningful for them. Another kind of key thing to keep in mind is effort. We have to consider the student's effort, but also our own effort. If you're trying to give reinforcement and it is taking up all your mental energy and your time and your planning and all the things, that it's really hard to maintain that reinforcer to the level that would probably be needed. So it's important to consider how much effort does it take to for me to provide this reinforcer? And then also, how much effort does the student have to provide? And that's going to be really critical when we think a little bit later about how to purposefully choose reinforcers. The rate is the rate at which you reinforce a student. So obviously, when a student is first learning something, we're going to reinforce a lot more. And then our goal is to fade that as they become more comfortable with a skill. Magnitude would be almost like, again, the student's effort. So when they do something really hard, we want to give them a big reinforcer. If it's something that's easy for them or something that is less of a stretch, then maybe the magnitude there is a little bit less. And always, always, always reinforcement is best when given immediately after the behavior so the student can connect their behavior with the reinforcer. So, real quick, we're going to take a processing pause, and I want you to consider, and you can think about things that you're doing really great, or maybe you're somebody who's a little reflective or good at kind of picking your own behavior apart, and you want to think about what I can do better. So, how do you feel about your current reinforcement practices? What works really well with your students, and what doesn't? So again, as I was in the classroom, one thing that I struggled with is I would come up with really awesome, inventive, exciting reinforcers for my students. I loved doing it. They got excited. I got excited. but I had trouble maintaining them long term. And there's nothing worse than telling a student, oh, when you get XYZ, we'll earn this, or here, we're going to try this as a reinforcer, and then not being able to follow through. So that's something that I had to be reflective about because sometimes less is more when we consider long-term systems. Something to keep in mind when you're working with students is the praise to reprimand ratio. In general education, you'll often see this as 4 to 1. So, four positives to every one corrective. That's another way to say praise to reprimand. In special education, specifically students who are in autism support, emotional support, the impact is at 9 to 1. So nine positives to every one corrective. And you might be thinking, that's insane. There's no way we could do that. That is totally bonkers. And I don't necessarily disagree with you. But I think the way that you get to the 9 to 1 is creating a culture that acknowledges each other in your classroom so that it's not just one teacher or one para having to say, thank you for doing this. You did so good. Awesome. Smile, hug, high five, blah, 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 blah. And then finally, it's like, get down off your table. That would not be efficient or effective. Instead, we get to the 9 by a community that acknowledges each other. The students can acknowledge each other. The paras can acknowledge each student in the room, the teacher, the administrators. When the kid gets on the bus in the morning and the bus driver, the van driver says, hey, I'm so happy you came to school today. The person who's holding the door says, good morning, let's make it a great day. That is how we get to the 9 to 1. So, do we only give rewards? This is often something we hear about. We're all very wary of the participation trophy culture. And what I'd love for you to walk away from today understanding is that that is not what reinforcement is. Reinforcement does not mean no consequences. We can use reinforcement in conjunction with consequences that are connected to the student's behavior so that they're meaningful. And I always, when I talk to teams, I go to them and I say, do you have the same students always sitting out from your school-wide rewards? Do you have the same students that are always missing out on recess? And usually, if they have the data, we can look at it and see that there are some kiddos that have missed every single thing. Why is that? Maybe they really have a skill that's missing that we didn't recognize. Maybe the student is just spiraling and really needs some extra support for their emotional regulation. But no matter what the reason why is, I can tell you that that consequence is not impactful to the student's behavior. So we need to find a way to get the student to connect it to their behavior. Another big thing to consider is the consequence relationally based or is it fear based? For some kiddos, fear based will work. For many, it won't. And I know that's hard because, I was a student in the 90s as well. And, we all lived in a world that really was at a time in the 80s and 90s based on fear, less than relationship. And it's not wrong per se, but I think we're recognizing that for many students, fear puts them into a mindset in their brain that more often leads to like fight or flight rather than a feeling of safety, which then we know students don't learn if they don't feel safe. So, again, consequences are really important. We want them to be relationally based. How did I harm others? How did my choice impact the people around me? Rather than just, oh, I'm so afraid of that consequence. A big thing to understand as a paraprofessional and as a teacher in general is say what you mean and mean what you say. If you say that you're going to offer a consequence or a reinforcer, you better follow through with it if the student does the behavior. So I like to use the example with my own boys who have autism and ADHD. So our house is super spicy. Um, that if my 5-year-old is kind of losing his mind and being a little crazy in the evening. And I say, if you don't knock it off, we're not going to Gigi's for dinner tonight. And then in my brain, I'm saying, we are still going to Gigi's tonight. There is no way I am making dinner. We are going there for dinner, no matter what he does. Well, now he kind of knows that I don't mean what I say. So keep that in mind when you're working with students. A big thing to take away today is that all behavior is a form of communication. However, it's not always conscious or relational, or I'm sorry, rational communication. So just because it's rational to us does not mean it's rational to the student and vice versa. And sometimes they just truly are so far into that fight or flight or freeze brain. They're so far down that it's not really a conscious decision that their behavior is. And escalating behavior is the communication of increasing distress. So if you see a student escalating, it means they are in distress. So first we need to get them back to a calm state. Then we can talk about the consequences of their actions, how they harmed others, and what can be done differently. A great way to talk about behavior and the unwanted behavior specifically is behavioral errors. And I like this because it takes away some of the emotion in this situation when we just call it a behavioral error. Behavioral errors occur because the students don't have the skill. Maybe it's a social skill, an impulse control, an academic skill. Um, Students don't know when to use the skills. The students might not have been taught in specific procedures or routines, or the skills are not taught in context. Those are all reasons why a student might have a behavioral error. So, a couple generative questions for you to consider. Why is it important to utilize reinforcement strategies in the setting you currently work in? Do you tend to consider negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement first when working with your students? And I think that's a great question because we all have our tendencies, right? For many years, I think I would have said negative. But the more that I work with students, I'm trying to shape my brain to also consider what positive reinforcer can shape the behavior because I know that it can work with students. And it's not that there's one that's right or wrong, but it's helpful to know what your gut instinct is. And do you know what reinforces your students? If not, how can you learn this? So maybe you're going back into a setting where students, you're familiar with them, you've worked with them already for a few years, and you automatically know, yep, that's my Spider-Man kid, that's my dinosaur kid, that's the kid that just wants a hug anytime they see somebody, that's the kid that just wants to make me happy, and they'll always look at me when they perform a behavior because they're waiting for my reaction. Maybe you don't know though. There are some kids that are kind of tough to crack. How can we learn this? Who can we talk to? Please consider these questions. You can write your answers and talk about it as a team. I think these are great questions to talk about as a team. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for your work. We are grateful for the work that you do for your students and for your school. And I'm always Team Para. So come back again next year.